By September 13th, 1987, nobody knew that a disaster was already unfolding in a backstreet of Goiania, Brazil. That morning, two scrap collectors slipped through a fence and into an abandoned cancer clinic. They were chasing copper wire and stainless steel. What they found defied their expectations. A heavy, cylindrical capsule, rusted shut, sitting in a pile of surgical debris. One of them forced it open with a screwdriver. Inside, a powder the color of sapphire spilled onto the floor, glowing even in the dim light. Fascinated, they scooped it into a tin can and sold it to a junkyard owner for $200. The owner thought it was scrap. The glow, he later said, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. That glow would soon invade every room, every spoon, every breath, and for one family, it would become the last thing they ever called beautiful. In 1985, the Instituto Goiano de Radioterapia moved into a new building, leaving behind a disused teletherapy machine. A source capsule packed with Cesium-137 was supposed to be retrieved and sent back to the manufacturer. It never was. Inventory records simply stopped being updated. For 2 years, the clinic sat silent, its windows broken, its rooms filling with debris and denial. When a dog dug up a piece of the machine's lead housing and died overnight, the neighborhood dismissed it as rabies. No one connected the metal to the source. This was not just a failure of one hospital, it was a systemic culture in which radioactive material was treated like office equipment. The mistake was simply waiting for someone to touch it. When the capsule reached De Ver Ferreira's junkyard, every warning sign was already present. The two collectors who lugged it through the gate carried it over their shoulders, later complaining of headaches. De Ver and his wife, Gabriella, spent the first night trying to open it, using a hammer and screwdriver. Their hands blistered. A foul taste filled their mouths, yet the only thing they saw was the glow. The next morning, De Ver cut the capsule open with a saw, scattering powder across the ground. He invited his neighbors to share the discovery. His brother, Ivo, walked out with a chunk wrapped in a plastic bag, carrying radiation like a talisman. 3 days later, Ivo's skin began to peel, and a local doctor prescribed ointment for an allergic reaction. The clinic where they sought help had no radiation training because radiation was a distant, textbook problem, not a Brazilian one. It was September 18, 1987, when De Ver Ferreira decided to pry open the capsule with a screwdriver. The capsule was intact, still sealed from the factory, but no one had ever taught him not to break it. In that single gesture, a small, rational, and completely understandable action, the disaster was made inevitable. He wanted to see what was inside. What was inside could be sold, and so the powder spilled onto the oil-black soil of the junkyard and was carried away in buckets that became family heirlooms, toys, Christmas gifts. The decision wasn't malice, it was ignorance multiplied by poverty and desperation. The result was 375 curies of cesium chloride moving invisibly across an entire city, not through walls, but through the hands of fathers, mothers, and friends who never learned to say no. The Cesium-137 chloride was not simply radioactive, it was biologically aggressive. It dissolved in water and sweat. It clung to skin, to food, to the blades of ceiling fans in the Ferreira home. Everywhere the powder touched, it left a burning imprint. De Ver's brother Ivo carried his piece in his pocket for 2 days. By the time he noticed the burn, the bone in his thigh was already under attack. The dust from the capsule scattered into the yard, into the beds, into the kitchen sink. A total of 1,375 curies were housed inside a capsule the size of a matchbox. When the material split open, the dose rate in the room was around 600 rads per hour, enough to kill a person in minutes. The people breathing it didn't know they were breathing cells of their own destruction. If this story is new to you, subscribe. There are dozens more the world tried to forget. For 11 days, Goiania's doctors treated the casualties as a mysterious outbreak. Patients arrived with vomiting, diarrhea, hair loss, skin wounds that refused to heal. The hospital's emergency room had no Geiger counter, no hazmat suits, no protocol. The medical staff cleaned wounds with bare hands, unaware that the radioactive chloride had already entered the water and bloodstream. When the physicist Walter Mendez first saw a piece of the glowing material under ultraviolet light, he immediately recognized the thallium-like glow. but even he later admitted he had no idea of the intensity. First responders who surveyed the junkyard initially wore only street clothes and work boots. Their personal dosimeters, where they existed, were not read until hours later. It was only when a doctor, Dr. Roberto, noticed that burns were appearing on hands that had only briefly touched objects did the word radiation enter the official conversation. And by then, 249 people had been exposed. On the night of October 1st, 1987, the Geiger counter outside the Ferreira yard hit 90 times the limit that would make a nuclear worker sick. The operator swung the probe toward the soil, and the display climbed out of range. Nearby, a crowd had gathered, watching from behind a police line. Children from the neighborhood had already been to the yard, touching the glowing powder. The number would grow to 112,000 screamed, more than a quarter of Goiania. As emergency teams raced through the dark streets with fluorescent scanners, they found granules in pockets, in purse compartments, in the cracks of wooden floors. The source was not a power plant, not a reactor meltdown. It was a metal box abandoned by a clinic that had failed to call the manufacturer. The international community watched with horror, the first large radiological accident in an urbanization of the developing world. The human cost was written in tissue. De Ferreira survived, but his wife Gabriela died on October 23, 1987, exactly 32 days after she first touched the powder. His brother Ivo also died, followed by Ivo's wife. The fourth victim was a neighbor, a young woman who had sat at the kitchen table scraping the glowing material off the capsule. She was 23. At the local hospital, wards were sealed off, and the bodies required special burial containers to prevent contamination of the ground. The families themselves were not told that their homes were radioactive until scientists had packed up their belongings into sealed barrels. Even the state's own geologists wore protective gear only after the initial survey. The final toll: 249 people contaminated, 5,000 imported monitors, and 1,200 cubic meters of radioactive waste removed to a deep repository. The names of the dead were never inscribed anywhere. The Brazilian authorities tried to spin the Goiania accident as a case of criminal vandalism, not institutional failure. But inside the declassified files, the story is different. The hospital had filed no inventory since 1984. The licensing authority never performed a single inspection of the decommissioned wing. And when the source was finally retrieved, it was carried out open, in a cardboard box, under a bare light bulb. The cleanup itself was managed by the National Nuclear Commission, but early workers were sent in without protective suits because the Commission's own logistics had been neglected for a decade. At the end, no criminal charges were ever filed against the hospital operators or the licensing body. The only person legally punished was De Ferreira, who was initially sued by his city for spreading illness, but the suit was dropped. He lived until 1996, a quiet and broken man, and accused of a crime that no one else was willing to admit had happened. The Goiania accident changed everything, but not immediately. The international nuclear community used it to push for the creation of the Convention on Nuclear Safety and the IAEA's standards for the control of radioactive sources. Brazil now had one of the most rigorous regulatory frameworks in the region, but the city itself carried scars. 14 houses were demolished, contaminated topsoil was removed, and a memorial garden now grows where the dead used to eat and laugh. The survivors continue to live with chronic thyroid problems, compromised immune systems, and a pervasive fear that their children's children might inherit what cannot be erased. It was a catastrophe of mismanagement, of negligence that turned a cure into a weapon. Yet perhaps the most dangerous legacy is the one that goes unnamed. A system that still relies on one human being, underpaid and overburdened, to remember what's inside a piece of metal. Subscribe to Nuclear Disasters to keep asking, who is watching the Watchmen?